Okay, welcome to the JWS Learning Podcast. Now, I'm Jonathan Huddleston. I'm here with Jonathan Watson. We're here to
Hello.
we're here to go and talk about lesson planning today. The reason being, John, is this Thursday I have a formal lesson observation, and
Okay.
it's always a good chance to think about some of those key ideas, those things that you sort of like to do in your regular lesson planning. And sometimes you think, well, let's get down to the nitty gritty of what really makes some outstanding planning. So hopefully you've had to think about it. What are the kind of things you think we should be bearing in mind for that?
Okay, well, first of all, John, before the lesson starts, you're obviously doing the right thing. You need to think about quite clearly what it is you want the students to learn. So what knowledge you want them to gain, what skills you want them to enhance, what understanding you want them to leave the lesson having kind of achieved. But you need to think about that relative to the student's starting points in order so you can make it as challenging as possible. In other words, you need to have high expectation.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there, and I think it's about trying to meet the sort of needs of all learners, isn't it? I mean, I often go on about sort of gifted and talented ideas, but it's about sort of pitching high and then differentiating downwards so that everybody finds their level, but it's at a high level each time. I think one thing I've always tried to think is context. So I'm always thinking, well, where are they? Where have they been? Where are they going to? And I think without understanding that about a class, you can't really pitch the learning objectives correctly.
Yeah, you're totally right. And I think where a lot of lessons might fall down, they might be good, but they might not be outstanding because the teacher doesn't really have a kind of exact understanding of where the students are and where they can get to. So, because if you don't have that, you can't push them as much as you want to. But you need to, if you do, you can push them to capacity.
Yeah, and I think probably alongside that as well, we need to know that the students themselves know where they are. So I think communicating that's probably quite important to them as well.
Oh, definitely.
So what next? What after I've done my
So you planned your lesson, but you've only kind of planned your outcomes so far. So what's important next is that once you've worked out your challenging objectives, your challenging outcomes, you need to kind of pick from your toolbox of provision the best methodologies that will achieve those outcomes.
Okay, yeah, and I think you're probably right. I remember I've seen quite a lot of lessons where sometimes you sort of go into it and you see something really sort of whizzy, exciting happening, but then when you think about it, there's a lot of doing, but not really very much sort of learning going on.
Yeah.
So what sort of examples of sort of active learning would you be thinking of?
Just before that, I think, and I kind of agree with what you've said there, because that's why it's important. Don't come up with the methods first. Don't come up with a great idea and think, oh, the students will really love that, because they might love that. But what's even better is to first of all think about the challenging things you want them to learn, and then to match the methods up to that. So to answer your question, give you an example. Just last week, I was teaching a lesson on the reasons why the suffragettes initially failed. Okay, plan those outcomes, and then the best methods to use was some kind of value continuum at the front, where they had to stand in the line according to how valid they thought their arguments were and move them around. But had the objective been to kind of then actually describe their activities, that would have been a waste of time activity, even though they might have enjoyed it.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. I mean, one thing I've always thought in these sorts of ideas is planning in advance the kind of questions that are going to go and elicit the sort of the responses and the learning that you want. So getting away from that sort of low-end taxonomy of sort of simply yes, no responses, and thinking, how am I going to go and take them that little bit further? So I think you've got a really good point there.
Yeah, and also, because you will notice that once you've planned your challenging objectives, they will match that Bloom's taxonomy anyway, if you put it challenging enough, because they will automatically take the students kind of up that triangle as your lesson progresses.
Yeah, so sequencing clearly then very, very important. And I think there can't be any wasted time, especially when you're tight up against it, because whatever happens in lessons, there's always something else that gets in the way of it working perfectly as you want it to. So
that's right.
Where would you go next then?
Okay, so then after that, so you've got your challenging outcomes, you've got your methodologies. The next thing that's really, really important, and I would say sometimes often forgotten, is that you need to have mechanisms in place in your lesson in order so that you can understand what they know and what they've learnt at various stages. So you need to think about how will you know what they know, but more importantly, how will they know what they know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think sometimes we're so drawn to this word plenary that we think it always has to happen at the end of the lesson. But actually, this should be happening regularly throughout a lesson.
Yeah, it should, and that's why your questioning is so important, because there's no point having an outcome and a task if the lesson progresses and the task isn't achieving that outcome. That doesn't necessarily not make it an outstanding lesson. What makes it outstanding is if you respond to that data and that information you're getting and continually adjust and to respond to what they're doing.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good idea to me. And I think the other thing as well, when I've thought about AFL and all those kind of ideas, and again, we'll probably look at this in a future podcast, but sometimes I've watched lessons where I sort of see what one student has learned or three students have
Mm.
learned, but sometimes it's how do you get the whole class to demonstrate that learning?
Yeah. So this all comes down to then those AFL techniques. But what's good now is that we're not talking about these AFL techniques as kind of tag-ons to lesson. We're talking about them intrinsic to the lesson, and that's why things like mind mapping and mini whiteboards and lolly sticks and kind of show me cards and things like that are so important, because they very quickly help you understand what stage they're up to and where you should go next in that lesson.
Yeah, that all makes perfect sense to me. So I've got my my learning objectives, my level of challenge. I've thought about my methodology. I know how I'm going to go and get a sense of how they're learning and communicate that to the students so they know. Anything else?
Yeah, so the final thing to bear in mind then is that you've got your mechanisms in place so you know how much they're learning, but is your plan too rigid that you can't respond to that data that's coming to you, or do you have the necessary flexibility so that you can change your plan as you go along in order to respond to how they're doing in that lesson? If you need to add further challenge or differentiate down or help certain groups, what mechanisms will you have in place to allow that to happen? Anticipation.
Yeah, that's a great word, actually, anticipation. And I think sometimes we've all had those lessons where actually it doesn't matter if I don't go the direction I'd planned initially, because something better has come out of here. And to cut that off at source actually loses something, I think, and it kills the sort of inquisitive nature that's naturally inherent in a lot of the kids that we've got at this school.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what we mean when we say we don't have to stick to the plan. You don't stick to the plan, and it's probably very unlikely you'll stick rigidly to the plan. You respond to what the students do, and you adjust accordingly.
Okay, excellent. So that looks like to me then hopefully there'll be the perfect lesson on Thursday. I've got one last question that I think is probably worth just sort of posing, because I think sometimes this is so often forgotten, particularly in formal observations, is that question of home learning. So I mean, I think personally that should be an intrinsic part of a lesson plan. How do you see that one?
Well, I think, home learning can do two things. First of all, it can really serve to introduce the learning that's going to happen in that lesson. Because if you deliver more content before the lesson, it really helps you challenge them more in the lesson, because then they can use that content and apply themselves in various situations, known as the flipped classroom. And secondly, it helps them then consolidate their learning that's happened in their lesson, most notably by applying that learning into a different context.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, John. And hopefully we're going to have some real success with the observation this week, but hopefully give some help to other people planning their lessons in the future.
I hope it goes well.
Cheers. Thank you.